Rights and Democracy. The second is Go Fund Yourself, Harvard to Trump, let's make a deal. And the third is Jewish Blood is No Longer Cheap. Then I wrote a very serious book called The Preventive State. I think I gave galleys out last year, but in May or so last year, this got published and got very, very good reviews from prominent people. The introduction was written by Justice Breyer of the Supreme Court, and it has endorsements by a lot of prominent professors and others, the Berkeley Law School professors, various places. It's about how we are moving away from reacting to terrible harms and trying to prevent them. Because A, the harms are so much greater than they used to be. Obviously, nuclear attacks, climate, you name it. But also our ability to predict them has gotten better too. And it creates the paradox of intervening early. And the subtitle of the book is The Challenge of Preventing Serious Harms while Preserving Essential Liberties. So the balance has to be struck in favor of liberties. But we have to take action to see if we can prevent things which are preventable from happening. Could we have prevented 9/11? Could Israel have prevented October 7th? These are hard questions. Would attacking Iran's nuclear facilities now prevent an even worse harm? How to balance the prevention against the consequences of the prevention. So that's this book. Now, in about another month, I'm going to write probably the most controversial book I've ever written, and it's called Could President Trump Constitutionally Serve a Third Term? And it has a cartoon in the back of the book, which kind of reflects the point of view. The cartoon has the founders, the writers of the Constitution, talking to each other, and one says to the other, just for fun, let's make what is and isn't constitutional kind of wishy-washy. And that's what happened. The place I can remember the Constitution is wishy-washy. It says that nobody who served 2 terms as president can be elected to a third term. And so I go through all the ways in which a 2-term president could end up serving. And it's interesting because Congress had before it various options. There were proposals to say a president who served 2 terms can't serve a third term, can't act the third term, can't in any way be in the old, and they rejected all of that. And they accepted this wishy-washy term elected. So if a person, for example, is appointed vice president, as you know, you can be appointed vice president. We've seen that happen throughout our history. Most recently, President Ford was appointed vice president. And let's assume instead of appointing Vice President Ford to become vice president, they had appointed Dwight Eisenhower. And then the president died, and Dwight Eisenhower, by the fact that he was vice president appointed, becomes the president. Could he serve as president? So that's what this book's about. It's kind of a thought experiment. Great question, okay? Yeah?
We just had an example of a twice elected president who served a third term.
Yes, that's true. Donald Trump. He was elected
No.
in 2000.
No.
But nobody.
Well, he was duly elected twice,
Right.
3 times. Barack Obama was the de facto president for either.
Yeah, but then by that theory, Biden could be elected to 2 more terms because he didn't really serve his last term. Okay, we'll try to keep politics out of this as much as possible, at least until after my talk. So that's the next book, and that's going to be very controversial. The book that I'm most interested in now is a book that I'm writing for the anniversary, the 250th anniversary of American independence. And it has a provocative title. It's called The Founding Fathers and One Jewish Mother. And it's a comparison between the founders of the United States and the founders of Israel. And of course, the Jewish mother is Golda Meir. And the reason I love this book is because it's based on my own personal collection of original documents. And I have all the original documents that helped found the United States and helped found Israel. I'll just show you a handful of them now. For example, I have an original copy of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which was the really incitement to the revolution. And then, at the same time, Thomas Jefferson wrote a book that's not very well known, but it's called A Summary View of the Rights of British America, set forth in some resolutions intended for the inspection of the present, not a good title, of the present delegates of the Virginia now Convention. But it is essentially a prelude to the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson wrote with the assistance of Franklin and Adams. And some of you may know, some of you may have read the book. Isaacson, the great biographer, has just written a book called The Greatest Sentence Ever Written. And he argues that the greatest sentence ever written by humankind was the one that says, well, truths are self-evident, and rights are bestowed, endowed by the Creator. Among these rights are the right to life, liberty, and happiness. So, in my book, I analyze that, and I say it may be the greatest sentence ever written, but it's completely wrong, completely false. All men are not created equal, as evidenced by the fact that the desk on which the Declaration of Independence was written was built by Isaiah, the slave, to Jefferson. He wasn't quite equal, and Thomas Jefferson was white in the coat because women didn't vote. And so all men were not created equal, and they're not endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. What's the best proof of that? Virtually all the rights we now recognize today were not recognized at the time of Jefferson, certainly not before that. Rights are not God-given. And if they were, why does God wait so long for them to be implemented? Most of the things we consider rights never existed in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. Rights are inventions of human beings. I wrote a whole book about it. It's called Rights from Wrongs, where I argue that the origin of rights comes from a recognition of wrongs, so that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were a recognition of the wrong of slavery. The post-Holocaust human rights laws were a recognition of the horrors of Auschwitz and other places. Women's suffrage was a function of our recognition, finally, that women had the right to vote. By the way, one of the things I cite in my book is a decision about 1886 in the United States Supreme Court, which denied a woman who had passed the bar, graduated law school, denied her the right to practice law in Illinois on the ground that God ordained women to have a special role in our society, not to be lawyers, but to be mothers. So that was the concept of rights only 150 years ago. So very hard to make the argument that rights are endowed by their Creator. And what if you don't believe in a Creator? Does that mean you don't have any rights? So I think it's a great sentence, but it's a parchment preachment. It doesn't reflect reality. It may reflect an aspiration. We would love to see a time when all men were created equal. By the way, I have a chapter in the new book, which I'll describe in a minute, about what it means to say created equal. We know that's not true. We know people have childhood illnesses, people are born with tremendous physical handicaps, people who have low IQs, high IQs, so they're not created equally. By created equally, I think what we mean is we have to presume they're equally valuable in the eyes of God or in the eyes of the country, should be treated equally. So, in this book, which is going to be a corporate table book, because it has pictures of my collection, it has a picture of the desk on which Jefferson wrote. It has a great letter from George Washington. I have the original of the letter, and the letter signed by George Washington was not not written by him. He was written by an obscure secretary. His name was something like Hamilton. That's right, Alexander Hamilton, who was his secretary in 1780, whatever, when he wrote this letter. And the whole letter, 3 pages, is written in the hand of Alexander Hamilton, signed by George Washington. And the reason I love this letter, in it he says, we're not going to lose this war to the British. We're going to win, but we may lose it to smallpox. And unless every soldier in the entire United States Army gets inoculated against smallpox, we will lose this war. And this was the first effort to try to smallpox vaccine had just been discovered by some, Russian royal who decided maybe he should solve the problem of smallpox by taking the pus from a smallpox sufferer and injecting it and maybe helping them develop an immunity. And that was the primitive form of smallpox vaccine, and some people died from it. But Washington said you had to use it. So that's one of my letters. I have an early original, there's no original copy of the actual Declaration of Independence. It disintegrated. The story about how it disintegrated is very interesting. It disintegrated because of the copy that I have. I have a very early copy. What happened was Congress, when the original Declaration was disintegrating, authorized a printer to make unique copies, original copies. What he did is he took paper, wet it, and put it on the original Declaration to get a copy. There were no Xerox machines, obviously. And that did create print copies, and I have one of them, but it also destroyed the original. The original is now in the archives, but it's in very bad shape. But there are several hundred copies of almost originals, and I have one of those. One of my favorites, and I write about this in a chapter in the book, is some of you may remember, or may have learned in school, about the famous letter George Washington wrote to the congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, in which in which he says, happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under this protection should in giving up all occasions of effectual support. And then he ends it by saying, if the quarter of the block of Abraham dwell in this land, continue to merit and enjoy the good rule of other inhabitants, while he shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none a lot of people don't understand. This is the first time in the history of the world that Jews were given first-class status, ever, by any head of state. There's a president to it. 40 years earlier, the British Parliament passed what was called the Jew Law. That's what the name of it was, the Jew Law. And it allowed Jews to serve in the Parliament without taking a vow to Christianity. It lasted 1 year. And there was so much opposition to it from the king, the queen, the media, the public, that it was immediately abolished. And so when George Washington wrote this, and when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, Jews were second-class citizens in the American colonies. And it took Washington and the First Amendment to make them first-class citizens. The other letter that I have, which is very interesting in the book, this is my favorite probably of all. This is a handwritten letter by Thomas Jefferson, written on the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1801. And he writes in defense of freedom of speech. And he says in his hand that we have nothing to fear from the wrong opinions of some if others have the right to correct them. The marketplace of ideas really is developed in this letter. And I have a particular sentimental feeling to this letter because my son Elon, who many of you knew, who used to come down here from time to time, who passed away this past August while we were in Israel, found that letter for me. We were together in a bookstore, the Argosy bookstore in New York, I was there to buy Brooklyn Dodger memorabilia, and he was there to buy Marx Brothers memorabilia. And the owner of the store said, I just got this letter from Jefferson's, from people who have held the letter in their possession since it was sent to their great-great-great-great-grandfather. Would you be interested? And would I be interested? My God, I read the letter and I bought it on the spot. That was a Friday. By Monday, I had written 12,000 words of a book called Finding, Framing, and Hanging Jefferson. I found it, I framed it, and then I hung it. So this is the Jefferson letter, which is really an important part of the history of the United States. Now, this is important. This is interesting. As you know, Alexander Hamilton was probably the most brilliant of the founding fathers in terms of just absolute brilliance, economically and in every other way, but he was a schmuck, absolute schmuck. First, he gets seduced by a married woman who clearly had no interest in him sexually. She just wanted to extort him, and she did, and he was forced to pay her husband, who set up the whole thing. The husband brought the woman to him to have sex. Great man, and they paid money. And then, so Adams and others, and Jefferson, who were particularly Jefferson, and a guy named Callender, who were not particularly fond of Hamilton, started circulating rumors that Hamilton had paid the extortion from Treasury Department money. He was the Secretary of the Treasury. And so Hamilton wrote a book, and I have an original copy of that book, Observation of Certain Documents, and speculation against Alexander Hamilton, etc., etc. And in it, he confesses to the affair, which probably denied him being President of the United States, and then denied very credibly, proved that the money came from his wife. Now, she's a good wife, paying extortion money for an affair he had, but it didn't come from the Treasury Department. So I have the original of that. Then, this is even more interesting. Why is he a schmuck? Because 1 year or 2 years, I forget which it was, after his son Peter is killed in a duel, and he complains about dueling and how terrible it is, he gets himself into a duel with Aaron Burr, and you've seen the play, you know what happens. I have all the first newspaper accounts, contemporaneous newspaper accounts, of all the letters back and forth, and how easily the duel could have been avoided. He didn't want to duel Hamilton, and he writes a letter before the duel to be published only in case of his death, in which he said he tried everything in his power to avoid the duel, but Burr didn't want to avoid it. And so his life ends, Burr's career ends, and you know, the United States goes on. So those are some of the letters I have about the American experience. Then move over to the Israeli founding of Israel. I have a copy of, an original copy, one of only about 100 that exist, of Herzl's The Jewish State, der Judenstaat, in which he sets out the theory of Zionism. And then I also have a book by a guy named Pinsker, who precedes him and actually calls for autonomy. He doesn't call for state, calls for a homeland, but he calls for autonomy back 20 years before Herzl. And then, this is interesting, those of you who are old enough to know this, I know that Dr. Cohn will appreciate this very much. This is an original copy of the original Hatikvah. The Jewish, and Hatikvah starts not as the national anthem of Israel, but as the Zionist national anthem. And it has the original words, which you can remember. You'll sing, you can sing it along with me. Instead of Liot Amkavshi, which now says to be a free nation, it said Lashuv La'aretz Avotenu, to return to the land of our father. And in 1948, when I was 10 and you were 12, 13, those words changed. And they took back all the books that had the original Hatikvah and gave us new books with Hatikvah. That was after Zionists proclaimed the new state of Israel, and of course it was attacked by every other country, and miraculously they managed to survive. Moving to more current events, I was fortunate to have been invited both by President Trump and by Prime Minister Netanyahu to the opening of the United States Embassy in Jerusalem. And I went there with my grandson, and Netanyahu presented me with a brick from the new building with a sign signed by him to me, which was really very, very nice. I appreciate it. I won't go on more and more, but the origin of Israel is probably, in some ways, in the Dreyfus trial, because Herzl observed the Dreyfus trial, and he said there's no future for Jews in Europe. And this is an original copy of Jacques, which resulted in Dreyfus being acquitted ultimately and being completely vindicated. This is an interesting letter, a handwritten letter from Dreyfus to Emile Zola's wife, explaining why he couldn't come to Zola's funeral, because it would distract attention away from Zola and toward him. So it's very, very interesting. I also have, if you want to go back a little further, I have an original, this is from 1490. Remember, the printing press was only invented a couple of years before that. And what does it first use? This is to create a blood libel. This is an actual picture drawn of a Jewish rabbi bleeding a Christian child and having his blood used to bake matzah. And this is the way, the Europeans saw that. This is a good segue, actually, into my next book, which is halfway through, which is called, I'll tell you a little history. So, this is only 3 weeks ago, before we came here. Carolyn had a hip surgery, so we couldn't come down here, because we usually do it after Thanksgiving. She had to heal it. So, the first night she's out, we go to the opera, and we see Porgy and Bess. And I'm sitting there, and of course I know every note of Porgy and Bess, and as soon as Sport and Life starts singing, it ain't necessarily so, the things they be liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. I said, that's my song, that's my life, that's what I've been saying all my life, it ain't necessarily so. So I decided to write a book called It Ain't Necessarily So, My Guide to Living the Life of a Skeptic. And first question I ask is, am I a skeptic because I'm Jewish? I don't know the answer to that, but when you belong to a group that has had so many lies told about it, we killed Jesus, we bled babies, we poisoned the wells, we won the world economy. The world economy, there's an interesting story about that. These two Jews are sitting in a cafe in Austria in about 1935, and one of them is reading the Yiddish newspaper. The other one is reading the German Nazi Red. One Jew says, why are you reading this Nazi Red? Read the Jewish newspaper. And the guy says, no, when I read the Jewish newspaper, all I hear is that Jews are starving, Jews are in trouble. When I read the Nazi newspaper, Jews run the world. It's rather good news than bad news. So, when you've been brought up in a context of so many lies being told about you, you inevitably have to be a skeptic. So this next book is all about skepticism. And, it goes through everything I've had my doubts about over the years, starting with my days as a yeshiva student and raising questions about the Bible. Well, wait. Adam and Eve, and then there's Cain, and there's Abel. Cain kills Abel, but then Cain marries. Where did he get his wife? Where'd she come from? Smack on the face from the rabbi. God who created the world in he created the earth before he created the sun. Smack. And usually, if I ask a hard question, the answer would always be, young man, if the question were a good one, the rabbis before you, who were so much smarter than you, would have asked it. And if they haven't asked it, it's not a good question. Which reminds me of the famous line from Damon Runyon, where the gangster is quoted saying, "Shut up," he explained. He explained. And so that's what my rabbis were telling me. Shut up, they explained. You couldn't ask hard questions. And so I graduated Yeshiva High School, the same Yeshiva High School Dr. Cohn graduated from, except he graduated top of his class. I was right at the bottom of my class, right at the bottom. I couldn't get into college because you had to have an 82 average to get into Brooklyn College. By the way, you had to have an 82 average if you were a boy. If you were a girl, 86 or 87. Imagine that lawsuit today. But I can qualify either as a boy. So I had to take a test. And I took a test, and I got in by the skin of my teeth. And then after 4 years, instead of being at the bottom of my class, I had the regular, I was at the top of my class. Same questions, just different answers. And then I went to Yale Law School, and I finished first in my class. You think that helped me get a job in a Wall Street firm? Turned down out of 32 Wall Street firms, turned me down. Many of them have since asked me to become a partner or become the head of counsel, but as I always say, too late, too late. So, you know, this newest book doubts everything. It doubts religion. It doubts atheism. I can never be an atheist because I can't answer several questions. The most basic question I can't answer, which doesn't allow me to be an atheist, is how did something come of nothing? How do you get something? I understand you can have little that becomes big. Big Bang Theory. I understand that, but where's the little? The other thing I can never understand, and I have a chapter on this, is, this is going to sound really weird, but I do not accept evolution as it explains sexual reproduction. I just don't understand it. Probably just not smart enough. Maybe one of you will explain it to me. But if you need to have, for sexual reproduction among animals and human beings, you have to have the sexual organs evolve from the way wings evolved, the way eyes evolved. And how do they evolve? They evolve through sexual reproduction. But how does sexual reproduction evolve? It either works or it doesn't work. And before it worked, how can it evolve? Because there's no sexual reproduction, which is essential to Darwin's theory of evolution. So I have a chapter doubting the Big Bang Theory. I have a chapter doubting evolution. I have a chapter doubting free speech as an engine of truth. I have a chapter doubting the adversary process. I have chapters doubting everything we all believe. And I hope a review will write something doubting me, and I'm sure that will happen. So maybe there are answers to all these questions, but the one answer I will never accept is your rabbis who are so much smarter than you. And, you know, people told me, literally 50 years after the rabbis told me that, I had an eminent scientist tell me exactly the same thing when I raised the question about sexual reproduction and evolution. Here's what he said. It was exactly the same. An eminent scientist. He said, the scientists who are so much smarter than you have figured it out. I can't explain it to you, but because the scientists have figured it out, you must believe it. Trust the scientists. Shut up, you. And I can't accept it. So, you know, I'll write my book. People will criticize it, people will challenge it, and then I'll have to write a second book saying, no, I don't have any doubts anymore. I've resolved my doubts about evolution, I've resolved my doubts about Big Bang Theory, but I'm not going to resolve them based on what he said. Some of you may know my friend Sid Rosenberg. He's on Sid in the Morning on the radio. He had a famous episode during Biden's last State of the Union message. He gets invited. It's the State of the Union message. I think Trump had already been elected, maybe, but I can't remember now. But in any event, he's in the audience. And Biden says, well, you know, the Israelis have killed so many civilians, and et cetera, et cetera. Sid stands up and a loud voice says who? And they, of course, pick him up and take him out of the Senate and threaten him with arrest. I agreed to be his lawyer, and he was never arrested. But, you know, any of you who grew up in Brooklyn or anywhere in New York, says who? That was our favorite thing. Mantle's better than, you know, Snyder. Says who? You know, Campanella's better than Ferris. Says who? You know, it was always says who. So Sid said, says who? And so that's a chapter name of one of my books. Says who? You know, says the scientists, says the rabbis. Not good enough. So I'm going to continue. I'm 87 years old. I hope the good Lord, if He exists, will give me a few more years so I can get up to 75, folks. I'm up to 65. I'm trying my best. And I was born a skeptic. I will die a skeptic. I will always have doubts, if anybody asks me, have any doubts about do you love your wife, does your wife love you? No, I don't have any doubts about that. Those are subjective items of love. I have no doubt about that. But you ask me about almost anything else, I'm going to pause, I'm going to think. Now we can move to politics. Do I have any doubts about Trump? Of course I have doubts about Trump. Do I have doubts about who's going to run against Trump? Of course I have doubts about who's going to run against Trump. Do I have doubts about the American system of justice? Of course I've experienced it. I've seen how many injustices there are. Do I have doubts about my role as a lawyer for the last 60 years? Here, I'll let you in on a big, big secret. I promise you won't tell anybody. Most of my clients have been guilty. Of course! Would anybody want to live in a country with a majority of people charged with crime were innocent? That would be Iran, that would be China, that would be Russia, that would be Cuba, that would be Venezuela. It's not the United States. In the United States, thank the Lord, the majority, the vast majority of people charged with crime are guilty. And in order to keep it that way, lawyers like me have to defend the rights of the guilty with the same energy that we defend the rights of the innocent. Now, I'll tell you another secret. Nobody ever tells me they're guilty. You have lawyer-client privilege. And so they're allowed to tell me they're guilty. And I tell them right out front, you tell me you're guilty, I'm going to defend you with the same energy as if you tell me you're innocent. No. Here's the way it happens. You have the first meeting, they say, are you kidding? Guilty? I am such a good person, I deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. By the second meeting, the Nobel Peace Prize is off the table, but I'm totally innocent. By the third meeting, maybe I crossed the line, but it was accidental. By the fourth meeting, yeah, I did it, but somebody told me to do it, and I'll rat him out if you get me off. And by the fifth meeting, it's please, please, just get me a lower sentence. So, the job of the criminal defense lawyer is not to produce a good result. That almost never happens. It's to make sure the result doesn't go from bad to worse, to worser, to worsest, to intolerable. So if I can save a person who's sentenced to death and get him life imprisonment, hey, that's a good day. If I can turn life imprisonment into 20 years, good. If I can turn 20 years to 10, that's the job of the criminal lawyer. It's mostly incremental. Sometimes you get lucky. I've been very fortunate in my career. I've had 32 homicide cases, and I've won 28 of them. So I've been very, very fortunate in that regard. But see, death penalty and homicide cases, in some respects, are the easiest cases. Why? They're black and white. Mostly either he did it or he didn't do it. Whereas these other cases, and I've had a lot of those, fraud, money laundering, you name it, they're gray areas. And they're much harder to win appeals on. But, I'll give you some examples of some of the cases that I was able to win. I had a case of a guy, Jewish kid from Brooklyn, who got in with a group of other two Jewish guys, who was selling drugs. Mostly marijuana, but they probably were into cocaine as well. In any event, they were selling drugs. They didn't get caught. They had a big sale, and one of the guys named Bush, Jewish guy, named Bush, said, I did most of the work on this, I'm keeping the money. My client said, no, you're not keeping the money, I need to get the money, I need to get some of the money. And Bush says, if you don't lay off me, I'm going to shoot you. And he pulls out his gun. And my client says, you're kidding me, you're not going to shoot me. And the other guy named Geller, there were three of them. In any event, what turns out happening is that Bush then shoots Geller, because Geller was screaming out, shoots him in the heart. He keels over backwards like that, but he's still moving around a little bit, maybe, we're not sure. And so Bush turns to my client and says, you're the only one who saw me do it. Under New York law, it's got new law, Says, under New York law, an accomplice can't testify. You can't base a conviction on the word of an accomplice if it's uncorroborated. So I want you to take your gun, he had a gun too, and I want you to shoot him in the head to make sure he's dead, in coup de grace. And so my client shoots him in the head. And now he's really dead. And so they get caught. Interestingly enough, Bush escapes, but my client is caught. And he's convicted of first-degree murder. So he has no money. But I'm on an airplane to Israel, and a guy comes over to me in the middle of the flight and says, "You're a criminal lawyer, right?" "Yeah, yeah. And you teach criminal law, right? Would you be interested in the case where a guy was convicted of killing a dead man?" I said, "No, I've been teaching that case for years as a hypothetical. You have a real case like that?" He said, "Yeah." And so I argued the case, and I persuaded the appellate division of New York that, the famous quote that he writes in the opinion, "Man dies but once." And because the government couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was still alive after getting a bullet in the heart, he gets acquitted of shooting him in the head. All right, but the court doesn't stop there. They then appeal it to the New York Court of Appeals. The New York Court of Appeals affirms the judgment below, says he can't be convicted of murder, but he can be convicted of attempted murder. And so the question becomes, can you attempt to kill a corpse? And there are cases on it. There's a case of a guy who wants to kill his competitor or something, and the guy's sleeping at night, and he sneaks into his bedroom and shoots him in the head. Autopsy reveals the guy had had a heart attack hours before the guy had shot him in the head. And so, and we ended up winning that case as well. And so he goes free. Should he go free? Reasonable people could disagree. Give me one more and then we'll take questions. So my other one is one of my favorite cases. A woman named Sandy Murphy, who was a dancer in Las Vegas. She did topless, beautiful woman, topless dancer. And the owner of the Binions Casino falls in lust with her. And they get married. And he's 70, she's 20. And of course she has a boyfriend on the side. And one day he's dead. And of course they blame the two of them. And they have proof. What's the proof? The proof is that he died, they think, of being burped to death. Any of you know what the word burp means? A burp comes from Robert Louis Stevenson short story called Burke and Hare about two guys from London who were hired by medical students to bring them fresh corpses. So their job was to dig newly dug graves and to bring the corpses because it was illegal in the British law in those days to have dissection. So these guys got lazy, and instead of digging up already dead bodies, they would roll drunks coming out of a bar, and they would burp them. They were doctors, and they knew how to do it, or they were at least medical people, so they knew how to do it. Burping is compressing the chest in a way as not to allow the lungs to expand, and you therefore die of not having a breath. And the proof that my client, the woman, was guilty is that they found on the dead body, Binion, who was a big shot, he's the owner of Binion's Casino, the World Series of Poker, so it was the biggest case in Nevada history. They find on him a mark on his chest, exactly in the place where the button would have been, showing the compression of the button. And the jury convicts and sentences them to life imprisonment. My client doesn't have any money, but this is an interesting case. I agreed to take it pro bono, but I said, look, I can't spend a lot of my own money, so I'm just going to do the case. I'm going to go out there once to argue the case, but I can't come visit you in prison. She said, it's okay, let's talk on the phone. So I argued the case without even having met her, and I win. I win because I'm able to prove that he didn't die of burping. How was I able to prove that? I found some old pictures of him as a young man in a bathing suit. And sure enough, that mark was on his chest. It was a birthmark. Now, we couldn't prove it conclusively because he had been buried before that, and we couldn't get the body exhumed in any event. Probably that ordinance still existed. It was now months old. As a result of that, we had a reasonable doubt, and we got her acquitted. And I met her for the first time. Carolyn and I went to dinner with her this past year. And in fact, she wrote me today because there was some anniversary or something. So, you know, those are the kinds of cases I've had over the years. I've had more than 30 of them, homicide cases. My specialty over the years has been homicide and science. So we won the OJ case based on science. Don't ask me whether he was guilty or innocent, I can't tell you. But I'll tell you a story about it. So one day, Carolyn and I were in Israel. And a new guy just gets elected prime minister. His name is Benjamin Netanyahu. It's probably about 1996, 7. Ella was a little girl. And I've known Bibi since he was 22 years old and a student at MIT. So he invites me to the prime minister's office, his new office. We sit and schmooze and some things. So I go to his office. So we schmooze and we take pictures. And he says, Alan, there's an office off the prime minister's office which is secure from any possible wiretapping or anything else. It's all we plan, everything. Come into my office. I have a question. I've just been dying to ask you. So I figure he's going to ask you about Iran. He's going to ask you about the Palestinians. He puts his arm around my shoulders and says, Alan, did OJ do it? So I said, Mr. Prime Minister, does Israel have nuclear weapons? He said, you know I can't tell you that. I said, you know I can't tell you that. So he agreed not to tell us. So thank you all for listening. And now I'm interested in the best part of any event like this always, which is questions. I have only one rule. Only hard questions. I won't take a question that says, oh, you're so nice, I appreciate it, thank you for doing what you're doing. It has to be a critical question, something that makes me think and respond. So please, ask your questions. Yeah, back there.
The ICE officers,
Louder, louder.
Did the ICE officers of Minnesota act within their lawful authority when they shot the two protesters?
The two cases are very different. And also the question whether they acted within the lawful authority is different from whether or not they were guilty of a crime. So in order to be convicted of a crime, there has to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt of every single element. In order to conclude that they acted beyond their authority, all you have to do is show that there was a rule and they violated the rule. I think the second one is clearly beyond the authority. There's no doubt in my mind that when they shot this young man who had been interfering, to be sure, in an arrest, and he shouldn't have done that, but when they shot him after removing the gun from his waistband, that was in violation of the authority of ICE or any law enforcement official. Now, if it gets to a criminal case, and it probably will, the other one won't, this one I think will get to a criminal case, his lawyers will argue that, the policeman's lawyers will argue that they didn't see that they had removed the gun. All they heard was, gun, gun, gun! And when you hear gun like that, and you're an experienced policeman, you immediately think that you might be the victim of being shot. So they're going to try to defend on that ground. I don't think that's enough for him to keep his job, but it might be enough to create a reasonable doubt. As to the first one, I don't see anything that is subject either to a criminal case or to a civil case. This is a guy who had previously been run over by a protester who tried to, and there's evidence of that, and I don't think there's any dispute about that. He was sent to the hospital, and remember, we've seen all the videos of the tire being pointed away. He didn't see that. He was in front of, maybe he shouldn't have been in front of, maybe he should have been on the side. But if you put yourself in his position, and you all know the famous case of Bernard Goetz in New York, where the subway shooter, that case was reversed on appeal because the instruction had been ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you must ask yourself whether a reasonable person would be in fear of his life. And the Getz legal team said, no, that's not the right standard. The right standard is whether a reasonable person who had the experiences that Bernard Getz had on the subway would see a threat to his life. And so the appropriate instruction in the case in Minnesota has to be, did he, having been once before run over, being in front of the car, not seeing the wheels turned in the way they were, did he act unreasonably beyond a reasonable doubt? And I think I can get it. I think I can get an acquittal in that case if I were the lawyer, but nobody knows for sure. But these two cases were tragedy. It shouldn't have happened. There's no excuse. ICE agents should have non-lethal weapons as well as lethal weapons. So if you have any doubts, you fire the non-lethal weapon, and you wait the lethal weapon if you have really no doubt at all. So I think it's going to be hard. Carolyn?
Should someone with PTSD or that previous experience be an ICE agent?
Well, that's a great question. No, I think if you have PTSD, you should not have a gun. But this guy had just had that happen 2 or 3 weeks before, and nobody knew whether he had PTSD. All we know is that he had a bad experience. And so I think it would be asking a lot to take away his gun and he had been 11 years into the service because he had been almost run over. That kind of blames the victim. But you're absolutely right. People who have...
If it's Getz.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Getz shouldn't have ever been a policeman. He shouldn't have had a gun. And you know what's so interesting? There's so much hypocrisy out there. You know we're the greatest supporters of the Second Amendment now? I mean, it's not the National Rifle Association, it's liberal Democrats who are now, oh, they love the Second Amendment. This guy, Petty, he had the right to have a gun. He had the right to pull a gun. He had the right to have a gun with magazines. How dare you compromise the Second Amendment if Trump's involved? It's such unbelievable hypocrisy. I mean, I'm not in favor of easy gun access. I do think that states that have easy access to guns have higher rates of homicide and shootings, particularly if you couple that with stand your ground laws now. You see the Arizona liberal Attorney General of Arizona, liberal Democrat, she gets up and she says, under the stand your ground law, you can shoot the ICE agents. I mean, my God, this is somebody who years before was calling for the abolition of the Second Amendment. But suddenly, when the ideologies clash, everybody changes their mind. Other than the people in this room, does anybody have principles anymore?
I was in the Air Force, and they taught you when you shoot to kill. And
That's for the Army.
Yeah, and also, if you get a gun, he may have a second one. And when they screamed gun, they knew they were in trouble over there. So could they make that argument?
They will make that argument.
And do you think it would be upheld?
Well, the way that argument works is, the other side will say, maybe he was justified in shooting the first shot, but not the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. But I think people, when they're trained to use guns in a lethal situation, they're trained to make sure that the guy doesn't, survive the first shot. All of this will be up to the jury. Now, the jury is both the best and the worst institution for deciding cases like this. How do you get on a jury? You get on a jury if you know nothing about the facts, and you know nothing about the law, and you know nothing about guns, and nothing about stuff. That's how you get on a jury. Total ignorance is the major criteria. So, jurors reflect, obviously, the biases of the community and the biases of Minneapolis, depending on, that's what jury selection is often the most important part of the case. In the O.J. Simpson case, we had to make a very hard decision. We had to decide whether, from our point of view, women on the jury and blacks, it's clear that blacks on the jury would be helpful to a black defendant who was accused of killing a white person. Whether you like it or not, that's the reality of race in America. But the question was then, what about women? And what about black women? So we had a jury expert, and they had a jury expert. And the two jury experts disagreed, we learned later. Our jury expert said, it was very interesting, if it was Jewish women, we know they put their feminism before their Judaism. But our research shows that for black women, they put their blackness over their feminine. And therefore, it would be good for you. The other side had the exact opposite advice. So we both wanted black women. We got 9 of them out of 12. And it turned out we were right and they were wrong. And that may have explained the verdict in the case, which obviously very few people agreed with on the merits. I'm sorry, you and then you.
Couple of things. On the Minneapolis case, the first case, the officer was hit by the car. And later he went to the hospital, internal bleeding, was released.
No, that was the first case.
The first case.
Yeah, the first case, yeah.
The second point,
No, I'm saying, that was the first case involving the officer weeks earlier.
no, he was hit by.
No. There is some video that shows perhaps a touching, and then there was a rumor that he went to the hospital, and what happened is you can see the videotape, he was walking away like he was going to a dance, nothing seemed to bother him, and then apparently, in order to make his case stronger, he may have checked into the hospital.
The other thing is, I'll give you a couple of examples of countries without a Second Amendment that are paying for it. Iran and Venezuela.
Well,
They were disarmed, and now in Iran especially, they're being killed.
do you think they would have been killed less if they had pistols and rifles?
Yeah.
That's the argument that's made. Maybe it would justify the killing even more if you have armed protesters.
Yeah.
These are reasonable arguments that could be made, but that's interesting. Yeah, you had.
Speaking of Iran, do you think that according to international law, Trump has a justification to bomb Iran?
Let me give you my first view. International law is bullshit on stilts. There is no basis for international law. People don't accept it. People don't write treaties. A bunch of academics sitting at Harvard and Yale who've never been anywhere near a battlefield write these things, and they're absurd. And if you look at the rules of international law when it comes to armed conflict, they are the most absurd things imaginable. As Dean Atkinson once said, he was the Secretary of State, no country in history has ever decided their fate based on international law. So, we're not bound by international law. There's no taxation without representation, no commitment to law without, we didn't get to vote on it. These are just academics who set out international law. But even if you take international law, there is a provision, I wrote about it in my book, The Preventive State. There is a provision that says if it's nuclear, you don't have to wait for it to be imminent. You can take preventive action. There's a difference between preemptive and preventive. What Israel did on 1967 was a preemptive attack. That is, they knew they were going to be attacked immediately, so they attacked first. That's completely legitimate under international law. But whether a preventive attack, which is not based on imminence, which is what the United States did when it sent the B-2s and bombed the nuclear facilities in Iran, that's preventive. And that's not accepted in international law, except when nuclear weapons are involved. So there is an exception. Now, probably international law today would say it would be illegal for a country to interfere in a domestic uprising in order to help the uprisers win. But every country has done that historically. And I have to tell you that if I were advising the president on this, and I did have a brief conversation with him, I was in the Oval Office for 25 minutes with him on Hanukkah. So we had a Hanukkah party in about a day before. He spoke to me within 25 minutes. And I did speak with him about Iran, and he did ask me a similar question. I can't tell you precisely what I told him, because that's confidential. But my own view is that regime change is absolutely essential. Peaceful means. If there were regime change, and there were something like a democracy, it would be a perfect democracy set up in Iran, it would end Hezbollah, end Hamas, create a foundation for real peace. And so if there's ever a war that was justified based on peace, it would be that one. But, you know, Trump is very averse. He's doing a very smart thing, you know, sending all the boats and making a very credible threat. None of us in this room knows what he's going to do. And I have to tell you, I don't know what he's going to do. I haven't discussed it with him. He didn't tell me anything. He asked me. But I don't know what he's going to do. But I think it was very smart for him to send the boats and to give Israel the air defenses that it needs. And hopefully it will either produce a deal that will really end Iran's nuclear ambitions. I don't know if that's at all possible. And the arming of surrogate groups, or there will be a military attack. I don't know which is going to happen, but I think either is permissible under international law. By the way, the term, it's not my term, Jeremy Bentham, 200 years ago, called international law hypocrisy on stilts. So that's what it's about. Yeah.
Well, wouldn't you think what happened, I guess today would be today, with Iran sending a drone over to try and hit the aircraft carrier and it gets shot down by an American, using a great deal of...
Oh, yeah, that's another war.
Yeah.
And, you know, he doesn't really need justification.
No, but that is...
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Look, remember that Iran killed 255 Marines. Iran killed many Israelis in Argentina. There's plenty of basis for attacking Iran and in conventional international law. International law allows retaliation. It doesn't put a time limit on retaliation. So I don't think he should be in any way influenced by international law. You know, Israel unfortunately has to be influenced because they can be sanctioned by the International Criminal Court. Their people can be arrested. The United States has no fear of international law, and I don't think they should be influenced by it because it doesn't deserve any real respect. Yep.
Do you think,
Louder.
do you think Israel could have done anything different than the way they prosecuted the war in Gaza in terms of the outrage that it caused in the world of public opinion?
Okay, sure. Let me give you some facts to start with that probably you don't know. Okay, maybe you do. In NATO wars and in American wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the ratio of civilian to combatant deaths ranges between 4 to 1 to 7 to 1. That is, for every combatant, in a good war, 4 are killed, in a bad war, 7 are killed. In some wars, 10 are killed, but it's never lower than 4. Even if you take all of Hamas figures at face value, every single one of them, assume there was 75,000 killed, and only 25,000 of them were combatants, that would still only be 3 to 1. And by the way, what is the definition of combatant? They say you're not a combatant if you're an 18-year-old child, boy. 18-year-old with a gun, with rockets. They're combatants. I don't care what Iran says. They're combatants. If you're a woman, you're not a combatant. Well, that's typical Iranian sexism. A woman can't drive a car without her husband being there, but she can blow up a synagogue. And so, if you really look at the number of combatants who were killed, it's not 25,000. It's much closer to 40,000 when you include the civilians, for example, who went into the kibbutzim on October 7th after Hamas went in first. Civilians went in. They lose their status as civilians as soon as they go in. If you allow a rocket to be kept in your house, if you allow yourself to be used as a human shield, you're a combatant. So yes, Israel could have done it differently. They did change their rules of engagement. After October 7th, they loosened up the rules of engagement. And they said, yes, you now can shoot into situations where you have good reason to believe there are terrorists hiding, but there are a multiple number of civilians. They changed the rules of engagement. They could have reduced the number of civilian casualties. That's up to the commanders. But that doesn't turn it into a war crime. Anybody who says that Israel has committed genocide is either a blatant racist, bigot, an anti-Semite, or a total ignoramus. and I include within that the Academic Council of Genocide that accused Israel of genocide. Genocide has a particular meaning. Genocide means what happened in World War II. What happened in World War II is probably best illustrated by the Isle of Rhodes. Many of you have been on the Isle of Rhodes. It's a Greek island, and it has had Jews on it since the Babylonian exile. About 25,000 Jews lived on Rhodes. None of them were merchants. They were all craftsmen. They made leather. They were poor. Nazi Germany diverted its soldiers from fighting at the Battle of the Bulge and other places to bring them to Rhodes, to put the 25,000 Jews on boats, to ferry them to Auschwitz, and to kill them one by one. And virtually every single person, every single Jew in Rhodes, babies, women, children, was killed. That's genocide. Genocide is when you have no legitimate war aims, and you just kill the people for purposes of destroying an entire populace. No, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not genocide. Maybe they were war crimes because the number of civilians killed was so great. On the other hand, the number of soldiers that would have been killed had they had to invade the Japanese islands would have been even greater. So it raises a moral and legal question: can a country prefer its own soldiers over enemy civilians? That's a hard question, but it was not genocide. What the United States did in Afghanistan and other places was not genocide. Genocide is what's going on today in Syria with the Kurds, where the Kurds are murdering babies and children without any armed resistance at all, because they want to eliminate the entire Kurdish population of Syria. That's genocide. What Israel did doesn't even come close to genocide. No serious scholar can look me or anyone else in the eye and say it's genocide. However, many scholars have done it. And that's what's happened to American universities. That now American universities are no longer, in many instances, places of scholarship. They're places of complete partisan narrative, and particularly focused against Israel. The rector of the University of in Holland, the rector of the university made an announcement the other day, and he said, any professor who denies that Israel's committed genocide is no longer entitled to academic freedom. In other words, you have the freedom to say Israel is guilty of genocide, but if you say Israel is not guilty of genocide, you lose your academic freedom. Can you imagine a university saying that? It's unbelievable. It's like saying, if you say the earth is flat, you have academic freedom. But if you dare to suggest that it's the sphere is round, you lose your academic freedom. Because that's how clear the fact that Israel is not committed genocide is. Yeah. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
So I join you in your skepticism, and I followed you for decades. I remember the media would describe you as a left-wing professor and a lawyer, and I've seen a few of your interviews where you say that it would be your great pleasure to not vote for Donald Trump for a third time.
I have the right not to vote for
Of course.
a third time. Right.
Yeah, of course. And given the dogmatic monoculture of academia today, given the hoaxes that were perpetrated, such as the Hunter Biden laptop being fake, and that Trump colluded with Russia, and that the COVID virus was a natural disease, what keeps you wedded to the Progressive Party?
Okay, it's very interesting. First of all, I did not vote for and could not vote for a Democrat. Yeah, I am not any longer associated with the Democratic Party. I have quit the Democratic Party, which I belonged to since 1952, when I walked the streets of Borough Park on behalf of Philip Shuttler, who was running for Democratic Assemblyman. I've been a Democrat all that long. And I did vote for Biden, but I did not vote for Kamala Harris, and I have no plan to vote for Democrats, either in the midterm or in the coming election. But I'm not a Republican, because I can't support their views on women's rights, on abortion, on gay rights, on the environment, on a range of other issues. I am an independent, and my wife, who I love and listen to about everything, has forbidden me from saying who I voted for in the last election, but she's allowed me to say I voted against Kamala Harris. But there are other candidates. I mean, you know, there are important people, so I'm not who I voted for. Donald Trump asked me the same question, and I gave him the same answer, and he gave me a very clever response. He said, "Oh, you care about sleeping with your wife more than you care about pleasing me." Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And my wife, believe me, she's read Lyssa Strata, and she would stick with it. So, yeah.
You touched on the horrors of Nazism. If someone were to accuse you of being a Nazi, are there any grounds for a defamation lawsuit?
No, not in America. In Canada, yes. In England, definitely in England. And in, I think virtually, certainly in Germany. Probably not in Iran. In Iran, you probably pay that money for it. That's a nice thing about you, but not in the United States. United States, defamation has to be very particular and specific, and it's very hard to prove, particularly if you're a public figure like me. I'll give you an example. CNN, when I made my speech, you know, as you know, I represented Donald Trump in his first impeachment. And afterward, I was asked questions by the senator. And Cruz, Senator Cruz, who was my former student, asked me a question. And I responded by saying that a president could, of course, be impeached if he committed any crimes, or he committed treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors, but he couldn't be impeached just for acting in a self-serving way and trying to get himself reelected, unless he's committed a treason crime. CNN runs a story all over the place saying Dershowitz says the president can commit any crime he wants as long as he doesn't get elected. It was a complete, total defamation. So I sued them. And the trial judge made a finding. He said what they said was a lie. Dershowitz said nothing of the sort. But he threw my case out because I couldn't prove that they lied with malice. That case is now pending before the United States Supreme Court. We're bringing a cert petition. And we're arguing that the rules of malice are too hard, and they just give the media complete license to lie deliberately. And so let's see if the Supreme Court takes the case.
May I ask,
Oh, I'm sorry. You and then you, yeah.
on that scale, why did they bring the Epstein case back? For what reason?
Because
I no longer
to sell soap. You know what the word
The
soap opera?
guy is dead, right?
Huh?
And the guy is dead.
We think he's dead. If the media can make money saying he's alive, they will. Look, it doesn't, and everybody loves this case. Everybody wants it. Everybody, you know, and I was right in the middle of it. I was his lawyer, one of his lawyers. I made the sweetheart deal, which he hated, fired me and refused to pay my fee because he said I have to go to jail and I have to register as a sex offender, and you made a terrible deal. And you're a terrible lawyer. By the way, there's an email in the batch of emails in which he says I'm a terrible lawyer. He made a terrible deal for him. I'm so glad that email was there. Let's be very clear. Here I'm going to upset some people, but I'm going to tell the truth. And here's the truth. There are some real victims in the Epstein case. There are some 15, 16-year-old girls who really have no agency. And even if they purported to consent, you can't consent if you're 15. The vast, vast majority of women who gave sexual massages to Jeffrey Epstein, the vast, vast majority, were well over the age of consent. They were paid for sex, paid $150 or $250, and they kept coming back because many of them worked in what were called, I never heard the term before, but what were called whack shacks in West Palm Beach, where are these massage parlors, which for Robert Kraft went to one of them, and where for $100 some woman will give you a happy ending. A lot of these girls worked in those places, and they were getting paid $50 to do a happy ending, and Epstein was offering them $250 for the same half an hour. So many of them just came back, and they had agency, and they could easily have walked away. Some of them earned an additional $150 by recruiting other young women to come in. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about the case. Jeffrey Epstein was a horrible, horrible human being. Carolyn saw that the first day she met him, and I didn't see it. I went to his seminars, I went to some fundraising things, never even suspected that he was doing anything with young people. I only learned of it when he retained me to be his lawyer. And, you know, I did a good job. I got him a good deal, a pretty good deal, and he thought it was a terrible deal. The reason we were able to get that deal is because in order to prosecute somebody under federal law, you have to prove that they crossed state lines with an intention to engage in sexual conduct. And all the women that they had against him lived in Palm Beach. And so none of them crossed state lines. And so Jeffrey Sloman, who was the chief of the criminal division, along with Acosta, understood that they might very well lose the case if they took it to trial, because there was no evidence of crossing state lines. They had one phone call that they thought was enough, and I wrote a brief showing it was not enough to have one phone call arranging for a massage with somebody who was local. So they got the best deal they could get, we got the best deal we could get, and that's the way, you know, I think it was Abby Hoffman who once said in the halls of justice, the only justice takes place in the halls. Plea bargaining, and that's what happened.
How many women were in the first case versus?
Well, the first case, there were only two women. There was one 17 and 10-month-old woman, and he was convicted, he was pleaded guilty to soliciting an underage prostitute. She was a prostitute, she was paid. And the other was a 22-year-old. And so those were the only two in the first case. By the time the second case came along, a lot more had come out. The Miami Herald had done their expose, but he was never convicted because he died, he committed suicide, was killed. We'll never know what happened. But the only thing he was convicted of were these two crimes, and he got 18 months in prison and had to register as a sex offender. He thought that was unfair. I don't think it was unfair, but people have the right to their own judgment. Last couple of questions, yeah.
Sort of two-part. With back to international law, one of the things that's concerned me reading is that young Israelis, all of them have to serve in the army. They travel abroad, they're getting arrested in various European countries. Those countries using international law to arrest these
Yes,
people?
so they're using the combination of the ICC, International Criminal Court determination, and they're using domestic, Spain, for example, is using domestic international law. They've domesticized international law. I have volunteered publicly to get on an airplane and defend any Israeli soldier, any Israeli official who is arrested in any country for committing genocide. And so far, none has been arrested and put on trial. I have also agreed that when Bibi Netanyahu comes to New York in September, I will be at his side, and if Mamdani tries to have him arrested, we will take legal action immediately. We have the briefs all set, and we'll make sure there's an injunction against
I'll bless you for that. The next question is a much tougher speculative one. And that is, it would be great if Iran had a change of regime. Turkey, to me, is at least as threatening. They're arming Turkestans. There's the ones that come to Kurds, but they will also go into Iraq, if necessary, to top of that regime. And they are a NATO member, and they absolutely want to attack Israel. How think Israel will respond if they attack Turkey as a NATO member? We are obligated to defend Turkey.
No, if NATO countries attack each other in some way, the obligations of American involvement don't operate. I don't believe Turkey would ever attack Israel in an unprovoked way because
Israel's not a NATO member, though.
I know, but it's an ally. But if Israel were to be attacked, I think Turkey would be thrown out of NATO. And I think, at least under the Trump administration, that would happen. And Turkey is aware of that. And Erdogan is not a fool. He's a terrible person, but he's not a fool. And he knows that his regime is a lot stronger than Iran. Although when he won a popular election today, if it were a really illegitimate election, nobody knows for absolute sure. But Turkey's economy isn't anywhere as bad as Iran's economy, so he's probably more survivable. But I don't think Turkey poses a direct danger. To show you how the world changes, when I first started to go to Israel and defend Israel. Israel had only two allies in the whole Middle East, Turkey and Iran. They were the strongest allies of Israel, the Shah and the secular government of Turkey. The greatest enemy was Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt. And now it's all turned around. Saudi Arabia, although there have been murmurings now of Saudi Arabia becoming more anti-Israel, but I think the United States will have some influence on that. I was recently invited to go to Saudi Arabia and meet with Chris, because I wrote an introduction to a biography that has just been written about him. And so he asked to meet with me. I don't know that I'll be able to do that, but maybe at some point. But Saudi Arabia is, right now, it's unclear in which direction they're going. But I think if Iran were to change regime, I don't think Turkey would take over and do what it's doing, because it would see how dangerous that is to its own survival. Last couple of questions, three. Okay, that's it. Yeah.
Hi, here in Miami Beach, you just had,
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
here in Miami Beach, you just had an incident where a resident posted against the mayor in a Facebook post
I said
that he was a clown, so forth and so on, and he sent police
he
to
didn't
question
say.
her.
He had nothing to do
Or the police went there.
Police chief sent police people to ask them questions. Yeah.
Well, I don't know, there's some emails that came in that he actually wrote to the chief of police and he said, send your detail, but regardless to that, is that a violation of freedom of speech in a Facebook post?
It's not a violation, technically. It's not a legal violation. Police are entitled to ask questions. It's wrong. People have the right. The woman who was visited is an impossible person. I have no sympathy for her, but she has her rights under the First Amendment to say outrageous and stupid things. And she takes advantage of that right every single day. But police shouldn't be visiting her. And I think that was a mistake.
Yeah, thank you.
Next, yeah, one more.
What do you think is the purpose of the Oversight Committee interrogating the Clintons and Les Wexner?
Well, there's a big difference. Les Wexner ought to be interrogated. He made Jeffrey Epstein. He created Jeffrey Epstein. There were all kinds of rumors and stories about why, but he gave Jeffrey Epstein this multi-million-dollar house on 70th Street. He gave him his airplane. In fact, the number of the airplane is Leslie Wexner's birthday. And he gave him, I think, 1% of all that was invested for him. And when you're investing $7 billion, do the arithmetic, 1% is not chicken feed. So I think it's legitimate to investigate Leslie Wexner. Leslie Wexner has been pretending that he is unable to answer questions, that he either has Alzheimer's or dementia. I don't know what. I think he's faking. And by the way, faking Alzheimer's or faking dementia under oath is a crime. You're lying when you do that, when you say, I don't remember, and you do remember. So I think that's legitimate. Bill Clinton was never on the island. There's no evidence he did anything improper. There's evidence that he was with. I can give you a piece of direct evidence on Clinton. It's a name-dropping story, but my wife will remember this well. The two of us were invited by what's Kennedy's first name? Caroline Kennedy. By Caroline Kennedy. Caroline Kennedy and her husband Ed Schlossberg lived about a mile away from us. And so they invited us to dinner with President Clinton when he was president, and with two other people. So it was just like 8 of us. And the Secret Service man comes over to Clinton and says there's an important phone call. And that happened a few times. And this time we walked away for about 15 minutes, maybe even a little longer. And he was in the way, he was jabbering and talking, and we thought it was about some national security issue. Comes back and hands me the phone and says, somebody wants to say hello to you. I say, hi, who is this? It's Jeffrey Epstein. So he had just been talking to Bill Clinton for 15 minutes. And he just said, how you doing, you know, et cetera, and that was it. But he talked to him for a long time. So I can vouch for the fact from personal experience that they knew each other. And the question is, did he do anything wrong? So I'm glad he's testifying. I don't see what Hillary Clinton could say. Because believe me, even if Bill Clinton did something wrong, the last person to know about it would be Hillary. That's going to get anywhere. I think that's political. But I'm glad he is testifying. And I hope they do get Leslie Wexner. And I would be very happy if they subpoenaed me to testify. Because I know nothing incriminating, except obviously after he was charged, and I was his lawyer. And by the way, one of the first things you ask somebody when you represent them is, do you have anything on anybody? Can you give me information that would help prosecute any prominent people? Maybe I can help get you off the hook. That's the first question you ask. The second question is, do you have any connections with intelligence? Do you have any connections with the CIA? Do you have any connections with the Mossad? And you can assume that I asked them those questions. And you can assume that the answers were no. Otherwise, they'd be in the FBI files, etc. So I just find it incredibly difficult to believe that Jeffrey Epstein ever had any connections with the Mossad or the CIA. I don't believe that for 1 second. But, you know, it's an interesting story, so people run with it. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you comment on the dangers of a country like Qatar, the dual roles they play, and how one deals with that, and how various presidents have, and what your thoughts are on how?
Yeah, so as you may know, Carolyn and I have been to Qatar twice. We were there as a guest of the Emir, and met with him, with his brother, with his mother, and my goal was to try to get him to be more supportive of Israel. We went there twice. I went back and gave lectures a second time. The third time was probably the most important. I was not in Qatar. This was July 3rd evening. The last year Trump was president, so in 2020. July 3rd, I get a call from President Trump saying, where are you? I said, Martha's Vineyard. He said, oh good, that's only an hour away from New Jersey. I need you to be here for dinner tonight. I'm having dinner with the Emir of Qatar and his brother, and the Emir wants you to be at the dinner. So, you know, my grandkids were there, everybody, and I said, no, I can't go. No, you gotta go. So they sent the plane, and he said, I'll have you home by 10 o'clock, and 11 o'clock. I get on the plane at 4, you know, I go to there, and they're standing outside as the Emir of Qatar. I have a picture, wearing ordinary clothes like he's going to a tennis match, not with his usual uniform, with his brother. And we have a picture with him with his arm around me, the Emir of Qatar. And we sit and we have dinner, just the Emir, his brother, me, Carolyn wasn't there. The owner of Newsmax, Chris Ruddy, and the president's wife, and the president. And so and my job, I have a job. I'm not there just for fun, because I'm a funny or interesting guy. I'm there to persuade him not to oppose the peace initiative, which ultimately became the Abraham Accords, but the peace initiative that was in the works. And so I had a job. So I put on my best advocacy, and here's the way the table worked. He put me at the head. The Emir was here, Trump was here, Melania was here, the brother was there, and Chris Ruddy was there. Those are the only people who did it. So I'm doing my best. You know how important it is for Qatar to make sure that, you know, there's no terrorism and all that. And I think I'm being pretty persuasive. Trump leans over right in front of the Emir and says, Alan, I have a question for you. So one thing he's going to ask me about peace in the Middle East. He said, why don't your people vote for me? So I said, Mr. President, I don't have any people. You know, if you're talking about the Jews, they are very independent. They don't listen to me. Are you kidding? They don't listen to anybody. And I said, you know, Jews vote on a variety. Okay. 15 minutes later, say, Alan, how come the Jews, don't they appreciate what I've done? Why would they vote for me? So that went on. But I did get a chance to talk to the Emir. He invited me to the World Cup. I didn't go. I haven't been in touch with him since. But when I was with him on the 3 occasions, it was so clear that he was trying to play both ends against the middle. He didn't want to take sides. He wanted to be the go-to guy for the bad guys, for Hamas, and particularly Hamas, but Hezbollah as well, in the Middle East. And he was also making deals with Israel. So when I asked him I pressed him very hard in your, why are you funding Gaza? Why are you know that the money that's going into Gaza is being used for terrorism. He said, no, the Israelis have urged me to do it. And he said, if you don't believe me, and he took out a card, and he wrote down the name of a guy and a number, he said, call me. And I did. And it was Israel's representative in Gaza who was helping with humanitarian issues, and I spoke to him. And he said the Israeli government is encouraging Qatar to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza. I don't think they had any idea at that point how much of it was being diverted to tunnels and rockets and everything like that. But, you know, Qatar is a very complicated situation. You can't live with them, you can't live without them. You know, they were, if not instrumental, they played a positive role in bringing about the ceasefire, although they played very negative roles in many other aspects of the fire, the non-ceasefire. So, you know, we live in a complicated world, and I just want to end by saying that skepticism is uncomfortable. Being a skeptic about everything makes it difficult to live a comfortable life, because skepticism also involves unpredictability. And I think some people are born with it, some without it. I'll end with a story that you might find interesting. It's a name-dropping story, but it's an interesting story. One of the people I was friendly with, people were surprised to hear it, was Justice Antonin Scalia, Nino Scalia. The reason I was friendly with him is because his father was a teacher, professor at Brooklyn College when I was the student body president. And it was during the time of McCarthyism. And I had some dealings with the father. And although we were on completely different sides, he was much more McCarthyite, and I was obviously an anti-McCarthyite. I got to like him as a person. He was a charming, nice man. When I first met Scalia, who was then a professor at Chicago, not a justice, not a judge, we bonded over his father, who we loved. Scalia is an only child from a Catholic family. He had 9 children, but his parents only had 1 child, so he loved his father enormously, and so we bonded over that. And we were in Israel together once. We didn't go together. He was there, I was there, and we agreed to spend some time together. We had debates. And one night we were sitting near the Garden of Gethsemane, you know, where the preparation for Jesus' crucifixion occurred, you know, a very important place in the New Testament. And you could practically see from where we were sitting where Jesus was crucified. So I said, I had had a glass of Brunello, and he had had a glass of Brunello, maybe we could have a glass and a half. And I was a little loose, and so I was able to say to a justice of the Supreme Court, if he allowed me to call him Nino, in private. So I called him, I said, Nino, you're the smartest guy I know. There's nobody more brilliant than you are. We're sitting right here. You look me in the eye and tell me you believe that a guy named Jesus of Nazareth was actually crucified, died, was put in a tomb, and then 3 days later became alive? He said, Alan, to the depths of my soul, I believe every word of it literally. And I said, you know that defies all the rules of nature, all the rules of science. It can't possibly have happened. He said, Alan, you don't understand. I'm a fool for Christ. I had never heard that phrase before. I'm a fool for Christ. He said, when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to my religion, I suspend all of my skepticism. I suspend all of my rationalism. I suspend everything I know about science, and I believe it purely on faith. And he said to me, Alan, I'm lucky because I have faith. You're very unlucky. You don't have the ability to suspend like I do. So you're stuck in a world of rational science, whereas I can live in two worlds. I can live in the world of science, and I can live in the world of unquestioning faith. And he was right. I can't live in that world. For me, it says who? Says Jesus? Says Jehovah? Says Moses? No, not persuasive. I want to see, show me the proof. So I'm limited, and he's not limited. I'm not claiming that it's a good thing. It's just, for me, who I am. I am a skeptic, and I will die a skeptic. One of my favorite stories is Gertrude Stein, whose guts I hate. She was a Nazi collaborator, but she was a smart lady. But she's dying, and Alice Toklas turns to her on her deathbed and says, what's the answer? And with her last breath, she says, what's the question? And I'll probably die, with that kind of an attitude. I won't die knowing everything. I won't die believing. I won't die with a full knowledge. I'll die with a question. And that's who I am. And I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a reality. And so I thank you all for your good questions and your skepticism. And be free to believe, be free to question, be free to doubt. If you are a doubter and skeptic, life won't be as good. Thanks. Oh, I have to say, there are 3 books back there. If anybody wants to, 3 books. Some of the books are right over here. There's back there and on the
There's a table there with books, yes. Let me just wait for you guys to take care of this, so I can give you also get some of these books. Yeah. I'll take it down. Yeah. I'm going to bring it to the table right now. Yeah, I'm going to bring it.
She probably went upstairs and said, "You're friendly."
I heard your question. Yeah. How are you? Hola. Yeah.